Hey, you're watching my official compilation channel, but if you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're uploaded, check out my main channel, Chat History. Alright, enjoy the video. Deadly medieval jobs. Like a low IQ fella who just ravaged a Viagra bottle, alchemy was simple, yet very hard. Simple in the fact that it had three main goals: turn metal into gold, discover a universal cure for all diseases, and achieve immortality. Simple on paper, but very hard in the reality that no one knew what they were doing. The vast majority of natural science at the time was still a mystery, and it was up to these alchemists to fill in the blanks. But on the path to reaching those improbable goals, many critical discoveries were made. Distillation allowed you to purify poopy brown water by boiling it and cooling the vapor to make less poopy brown water. Many plants could be mashed into festering wounds to make them feel less like you're about to die. And sprinkling some sulfur and charcoal over your non-suspicious pile of potassium nitrate could create something called black powder that may or may not be useful in some sort of gun-like device in the future. But every new discovery was the result of thousands of failures. Sure, alchemy would eventually shed away a lot of the primitive theoretical slag and refine itself into modern-day chemistry, but it took millennia of trial and error, and many died in the pursuit of eternal health and infinite wealth. The extent of the alchemical process boiled down to purification, isolating crude elements into their purest forms. And how do you purify things? Fire. Just heat stuff up until something happens. And that was the main problem. You see, alchemists had a rudimentary approach to their own safety when it came to faffing about with toxic substances. Their main form of protection was wearing long robes, or at the bare minimum, a durable leather apron. This would, at the very least, give +5 defense against any spontaneous splishes and splashes of any would-be lotions and potions. But if you've ever been chewed out by your chemistry professor, you know that's often the least of your worries. Now, getting a drop of salty water in your eye at school may seem trivial, but if that harmless sodium chloride enriched dihydrogen monoxide were instead something more spicy like, say, boiling hot mercury, and then things get a little bit more life-threatening-y. Alchemists didn't really use face or eye protection outside of just squinting a little bit and hoping for the best. But when that plugged beaker of boiling broth decides it wants to overcome a pressure differential, you're gonna wish that something was there between you and it. Now, if you were careful enough to uncork your cooking concoctions, you still had to deal with its byproducts. One of the most mysterious and thus often studied materials was liquid mercury. Since it looked like a metal yet flowed like a liquid, the element was often mistaken for the highly sought-after elixir of life itself, bringing many to an untimely end. But that didn't stop alchemists from trying to unlock its potential secrets. In any case, the last place that you would want to be burning toxic metals is somewhere cramped and poorly ventilated. Well, it's a good thing that many of the alchemical labs in medieval times were cramped and poorly ventilated, filled with lots of flammable books and papers to boot. So when putting toxic elements to the flame, like mercury or arsenic, you're gonna form some nasty fumes. Historical texts allude to these dangers, stating that the vapors, quote, injured the spirit and body. Trying to unlock the phenomenal cosmic powers in your itty-bitty living space is gonna mean trading breathable air for some that is deadly. The high concentration will almost certainly make your temporary life even more temporary. Your last feelings as you migrate to regions beyond will be that of you coughing up your burning lungs while your pounding brain feels like it's gonna burst out of your skull. Fun stuff. But even if you managed to dodge death in the short term, he was gonna win the long game. Memory loss, hallucinations, or even paralysis are all possible side effects from long-term mercury and arsenic exposure. Sometimes, though, the most dangerous beast is ourselves. Unless directly employed by a higher power, alchemists often practice their craft in secret, not only to protect any possible discoveries, but to avoid accusations. Many of the more feeble-minded people at the time mistook the scientific aspects of alchemy for witchcraft and sorcery with all that conjuring of flames and whatnot. So if the explosions, fires, or fumes didn't get you, Ned the nosy neighbor might. You can already see how this one's gonna go. Listen, royalty has always been a world of extravagance and bragging rights. Get conquered, and you can bet that all of your treats and treasures were on full display to boast to other royals.
Look how big my shiny rod is.
Aye, take a gander at me family jewels.
Very nice.
But not all wealth was silver and gold, as King Henry III of England would soon come to realize in 1235. Arriving on the front doorstep one morning was a gift. 3 gifts, actually. As a present in good faith to maintain political relationships, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire dumped 3 adult lions on Henry's doorstep.
Bah!
King Henry absolutely adored the giant cats and set them up in a less than suitable habitat within the Tower of London, opening up the royal menagerie to royal guests as a royal flex. The menagerie eventually expanded, with elephants, a polar bear, non-polar bears, and several monkeys all taking residence within the walls. Now, each and every one of these exotic animals required special care, so in order to provide said care, specially trained animal experts were hired to do the job, right? No. It was, of course, cheap, uneducated, and expendable laborers that were the prime candidates. Poor, unfortunate souls sent to clean, feed, and care for the beasts. And it was all easier said than done. No matter how friend-shaped wild animals may seem, they're still wild animals, and they will murder you at a moment's notice. Once you stepped into the literal lion's den, you were at their mercy. Without extensive knowledge on how to meet their most basic needs, these animals were often feral and malnourished, and thus a very real threat, especially when you're looking like a tasty treat. Habitats at the time, if you could even really call them that, were often poorly constructed and weren't any more complex than a simple cage. Some historical records allude to incidents of collapsing cages or animals managing to break free from their chains and ripping apart caretakers limb from limb. It wasn't uncommon to catch a claw from time to time, or witness your buddy get converted into a PNG under an elephant's tree trunk of a foot. If you did manage to survive the animals unscathed, you might not survive your employer. Like I said before, the animals were royal property, so failing to keep them healthy may as well be a slap in the face of the king himself. Any keepers responsible for a premature death of an animal were in for severe punishment. The lucky ones were simply fired. The less than lucky ones were also fired. The profession of plague rat catcher is pretty self-explanatory. Bunch of plague-infested rats carrying plague-infested fleas running amok needed to be dealt with. Humanely, of course. Although rat catching or vermin extermination itself has been a profession for as long as rats have been around, they were especially in high demand during the time of the Black Plague. European cities like Paris or London were chock full of the little beasts. The spreading of the disease wasn't exactly well understood at the time, and instead of placing the blame on microscopic corn dogs, the usual go-to scapegoats were the devil, poisonous air, or the classic Jews. But some pattern-recognizing fellows realized that filthy rats usually carry filthy diseases. And it was true. Black rats, as they're known, very much did carry debilitating diseases. You got your leptospirosis to ruin your day, muscles always aching, fever never breaking, your liver dies, stinging red eyes, and a rash that never goes away. You also had salmonella, which causes you to frequently force out fluids from front to back, but also makes you solid in your daily crosswords. When you don't want a mass infestation to evolve into a mass infection, rat catchers were hired to help minimize the spread as best they could. Rat catchers would hunt, trap, and kill the vermin, but in doing so, they put themselves at severe risk. The thing is, rats don't exactly like being caught, so they're gonna go into a full-fledged survival panic, gnashing and gnawing at anything nearby, which would most likely be fingers, hands, an arm, or a face. The obvious problem with that is the contraction of the aforementioned diseases as well as the Black Plague itself. Of course, there were many other hazards. Remember them fleas I mentioned? Well, they would do a little emigration to a new host. You. Once you were infected, all of your own personal fleas and lice, since you're a dirt poor medieval peasant, would then further spread diseases like wildfire. But bites and bugs weren't the only threat. Rat catchers often had to venture into enemy territory, squeezing through holes and swimming through cesspits to find rat nests to kill them at the source. Rummaging around in all of that danky and stanky meant a lot of environmental exposure. Sustaining a simple scrape against a stone slab that's subsequently slathered in shit leads to a nasty, potentially life-threatening infection. Similar to the gong farmers or night soilmen from my previous Worst Jobs video, these rat catchers could also succumb to suffocating in sewer slop. Not only that, but the frequent use of arsenic-based rat poison could do a number on the lungs. The good news, though, is that all of the success of the medieval rat catchers helped severely limit the spread of the Black Plague, bringing the total death count to only tens of millions of people. You did your best, rat catchers, and it makes for a nice tale. Now, if you think that grave robbing wasn't a job, think again. Although highly illegal, grave robbers still performed work with the goal of getting paid based on whatever they could yoink from defenseless corpses. Compensation for work sounds like a job to me. And it was way more common than you'd think. According to archaeological studies by the University of Cambridge, it's estimated that over 20% of graves in northern and western medieval Europe showed evidence of tampering between the 5th and 6th centuries. Graves were robbed for two main reasons. The first, and most obvious, was stealing valuables. This could be anything from grandma's bracelets, rings, or even her iconic red jewel. If you were brave, you could even rip out Gam Gam's golden teeth. The other reason was stealing the bodies themselves, much more difficult, but potentially more lucrative. In the late medieval period, a medical revolution was underway, meaning that practicing physicians were in need of cadavers to poke and prod to figure out how humans worked. The fresh ones were preferred, but beggars couldn't be choosers. But they could be grave robbers. The dangers of the infamous side hustle were plentiful. For one, just digging 6 feet into the earth is not easy. If you've ever woken up to a few tons of gravel dumped into your driveway with your dad enthusiastically standing there with a shovel, you have an idea of how much it would suck. But besides the ergonomic injuries, digging that deep in fresh soil was very dangerous. By definition, loose soil isn't very stable, and there have been multiple reports throughout history of grave robbers being discovered buried in the very graves they attempted to rob. Robbers were also running the risk of digging up the diseased deceased. Victims of the plague, tuberculosis, leprosy, and smallpox can have their afflictions live on far after their own deaths. If life was like a box of chocolates, then death was simply a sack of farts. You knew exactly what you were getting, you just didn't know how bad. Cracking open a coffin could leave you coffin instead. But it was a known risk. If falling dirt and disease failed to cut your life short, then someone else would. Grave robbing was a crime, a very serious crime, and graveyards were holy property, and as such, any guards patrolling could act as your judge, jury, and executioner. Guards were granted special permission to deal with any disturbances any way they saw fit, like fitting a spear through your skull. Luckily, you've already done all the heavy lifting of digging a grave. The guards just had to tidy up. If the guards were more merciful, you would simply be arrested and your fate left to the courts. But you would most likely end up 6 feet over the ground before you ended up 6 feet under it. Bell ringers actually had a pretty important job for the everyday person. They were the timekeepers. Yeah, sure, there was that big glowing ball in the sky to tell you dawn and dusk, but all the other hours were approximations. It was up to bell ringers to mark the important times of the day, call people to service, or chime special occasions. But doing so was extremely physically taxing. A standard tower bell could weigh anywhere between a few hundred pounds all the way up to several tons. Granted, the big-ass bells required multiple people, but each man pulled his own weight, and then some. Having a tug-of-war match with a several-ton hunk of metal isn't the best wager to make. The sheer momentum of these bells as they swung back and forth was something to be reckoned with, and it demanded respect. Or else. A survey conducted in 1990 asked several thousand London bell ringers about any injuries sustained during their ringing duties, and the answers didn't leave much to the imagination. Ripped fingernails, crushed limbs, falls from the tower, and even accidental hangings had occurred. Ringing ropes became a death trap if the ringers became too complacent. Now keep in mind, this was in the 1990s, well into the modern age with considerations for safety. So imagine how much more frequent these types of injuries must have occurred back in medieval times. If you weren't snagged by the rope, you certainly had your bones rattled by the deafening sound of the bells themselves. Many of the large city towers were equipped with multiple bells, each one producing different pitches or rung under different circumstances. Being right in the middle of all that crippling cacophony meant the risk of blowing out your eardrums. Each separate ring could emit a head-splitting 120 decibels, well into the deafening range of sound, even if only momentarily. For comparison, 120 decibels is like being right next to T-Swift's private jet as it takes off to cross the street. Each of those bursts of sounds were enough to cause permanent damage to hearing unless protection was used. And you know damn well medieval bell ringers didn't use no protection. They simply took the method of, you'll get used to it. The biggest threat to a ringer's life, however, wasn't the bells or the ropes, but something a bit more flashy. Lightning. You see, back in the God-fearing, superstitious times of old, thunderstorms were believed to be moments of divine rage. But don't worry, when God's mad, you can just soothe them with the sweet clang of tuned metal. Or, at least, that was the belief. Many medieval fellas instructed the poor ring-a-dingers to bang their bells in an attempt to chase away thunderstorms. And wouldn't you know it, didn't work. Some reports from the 1700s claim that over 100 bell ringers gained first-hand experience of the human body's ability to conduct electricity. Lightning could either strike the tower or the bell directly, delivering a death jolt down the rain-soaked line and through the poor soul attempting to single-handedly banish an entire fucking thunderstorm with a series of Taco Bell bongs. The number of deaths got so bad that some countries, like France, surrendered to the heavens and banned thunderstorm bell ringing until the invention of the lightning rod in the mid-1700s. Although it seemed like a relatively safe and simple job, working high in the tower had plenty of ways to get dinged in your dong. Alright, hear me out. The medieval scribe was by no means an adrenaline-charged, fast-paced profession, but that's kind of the point. The life of a medieval scribe was the most bland, boring, and mind-numbing jobs in all of human history. Before Papa Gutenberg invented his famous printing press, entire books were written by hand. This process was physically exhausting, mentally taxing, and extremely slow, resulting in books being expensive, which is why books were for rich people. But the requirement for a personal touch did allow for creative freedom, creating unique works of art with each copy. Sweet. But there's only so many times you can generate artistic flourishes around the word "the" before your creative juices start drying up. As a medieval scribe, your job was to write. All day, every day. Except Sundays. Those are for Jesus. But all of that writing, especially in the same position day in and day out, puts a very real toll on the human body. We simply weren't designed to sit for most hours of the day. So stop slouching. Scribes worked in specialized rooms called scriptoriums, which held all of the cutting-edge equipment needed for efficient scribbling: a writing desk, ink, paper, and feathers for quills. As for content, scribes copied a wide variety of topics: science, history, cultural literature, and of course, religious texts. This ensured that tradition and know-how could be passed down across the generations, binding knowledge in paper and leather. But them's a lot of words to read and write. Scanning hundreds of thousands of words with your eyeballs took a toll on them. The constant nearsighted strain often resulted in scribes fucking up their vision and developing chronic migraines. Now, there's often a misconception that, hell, even I had prior to researching this, that scribes were these frail old men writing by candlelight. That's not true. Instead, scriptoriums were specifically designed to take advantage of natural light, with windows facing the east to bathe in the morning sun. Writing desks were set up near these windows to maximize their illumination. The setting of the sun simply meant that your shift was over. Now, what people might not realize is that back in the day, candles were very expensive, and so was paper, so it would be stupid to literally burn through your money in a dimly lit room full of flammable paper. But yeah, like I said, all of that repetitive writing posed very real ergonomic hazards. The constant swishing of a quill across pages put a lot of wear and tear on joints and muscles, resulting in agonizing carpal tunnel syndrome and severe spinal deformations from all of the hunching over. But if osteoarthritis or chronic back pain weren't enough for you, other inherent dangers were waiting. Another health hazard for these scribbling scribes was the very medium used to immortalize history: the ink. Standard black ink was made from plant-based fluid and iron sulfate. Black was the most common color, thus it made up a vast majority of the writing, and luckily it wasn't too terribly toxic. But all of the fancier colors used to decorate or illuminate the pages certainly were. Vermilion red ink contained mercury, vibrant yellows and greens used arsenic, and bright white ink used lead. Exposure or absorption through the skin was known to have caused chronic physical or mental symptoms like rashes, headaches, and memory loss. Which brings up one of the more dangerous aspects of the job. It was actually very common for scribes to leave little notes in their copies alluding to them losing their friggin' minds. A note at the end of an 8th century book says, "He who does not know how to write does not think that it is a labor. 3 fingers write, the whole body labors. Whoever has read this book, pray for me." Another scribe from the 11th century wrote a little note at the end of his writing endeavor. It says, "Thus let this composition be ended here. God help my hands." And finally, we come to one of the most damning examples. It reads, "This shit sucks." This was a real problem. The constant mental anguish of doing nothing but writing for years caused some scribes to teeter on the edge of insanity, where a comfortable rope necklace could free them from their suffering. Metaphorically, of course. Scribes really were some of the most unsung heroes. Despite the mundane career path, they were a critical part of human history. They were the ones who preserved it, or at least their version of it. After all, writers had the right to write what they thought was right. Evil Human Experiments. Part 4. This was the Willowbrook State School for Children with Intellectual Disabilities in Staten Island, New York. Yay! And it was home to one of the worst cases of human experimentation ever conducted on American soil. Oh. Originally constructed in 1942 as a United States Army hospital, the facility was quickly converted to a state-sponsored mental institution in 1947 after the World War sequel rolled its credits. But as you can imagine, anything state-sponsored usually turns to shit over time. Well, over the following decades, everything went to shit. Originally designed to house 4,000 students, the school was bursting at the seams as it struggled to contain over 6,000. Poor funding and understaffing led to abhorrent living conditions for the children and young adults who called the facility home. Although the school advertised proper care and treatment for its students, the reality was far different from this facade that they tried to sell. Reporters who visited the school wrote of the horrors within the walls, documenting the absolute filth and neglect that these children were experiencing. Children pointlessly wandered or sat isolated throughout the day, some children locked in rooms for hours on end, and some savagely beaten by their supposed caretakers. No treatments were being administered, no attention given, no attempts at any education whatsoever. Now, this isn't to say that the entire staff was cruel. Some of the nurses did try their best to care for patients using what little resources they had, but like I said, the entire school was critically understaffed, with some single caregivers given responsibility for over 100 children each. There's no feasible way to provide an adequate level of care when you're spread so thin. Any staff who spoke out about this were either silenced or fired. New York state representatives couldn't give a flying flip about the living conditions of those that they deemed parasites on society. It's a waste of money, it's a waste of labor. Now, on top of all of this, the horrendous living conditions of filth and neglect made way for a worse threat: disease. By 1958, nearly 90% of the children at Willowbrook were infected with hepatitis, with most new arrivals contracting it within days. In order to address this, they called in an expert. Dr. Saul Krugman. Hello. He was the leading physician in the study of hepatitis at the time, so understandably, he was the right man for the job. You see, hepatitis had been wreaking havoc across known human history, dating all the way back to the times of the ancient Greeks. The big bearded daddy of medicine himself, Hippocrates, documented outbreak symptoms of fever, liver damage, and yellowing skin, the same symptoms as hepatitis. With the virus having a recent outbreak on American troops during World War II, Krugman wanted to release humanity from its grasp, by any means necessary. And to do that, he needed data. To get that, he needed subjects. The children. Well, they wouldn't be able to consent to such experiments now, would they? The harsh truth is that most of these kids had limited mental function as it was, but there was a little thing called the Declaration of Helsinki that would prove useful. In case you're unaware, after the Nuremberg medical trials where Nazi doctors and nurses were tried for their war crimes, a medical code was developed, the Nuremberg Code. Established in 1947, the code brought forth a set of 10 ethical principles for human experimentation. As we know, human experimentation is a medical necessity. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But there are more ethical approaches that we can take to be respectful of those whom are being experimented on. Things like voluntary informed consent, or the subject's right to withdraw from experimentation if they feel that they are in danger. But just to be clear, the code was not legally binding. It was just a strong set of guidelines. In 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was proposed, another set of ethical guidelines built from the Nuremberg Code but with a little bit more detail and some slight changes. For Krugman's case, these are the most important. Informed consent could now be granted by legal guardians should the subject be incapable of providing consent themselves. Also, medical providers were given the responsibility to stop experimentation if, in their judgments, the experiments were causing harm.
So how did that last pill make you feel?
Pretty good.
Symptoms have dissolved.
Good. This revised set of codes put Krugman at an advantage, and he was about to activate his trap card. He now had a slew of potential test subjects at his disposal. He just needed their guardian's consent. Krugman then drafted carefully worded letters explaining the research, recruiting parents to send their intellectually disabled children to Willowbrook. Parents were promised that if they gave consent, their children would be given priority to be admitted to newer and cleaner research wards and given experimental vaccines to possibly become immune to hepatitis. They were basically told, hey look, your kid's gonna get hepatitis anyway. Might as well let us test this experimental medicine. Sure, Willowbrook did have a terrible reputation as a care facility, but it was still a care facility and remained the only option for some families. Within a few weeks, Krugman had 700 children volunteered by their desperate parents. Parents who just wanted to give their children a chance at proper care that they couldn't provide themselves. Upon admittance into the school, experiments were conducted in two main phases, one for immunity studies and the other for treatment studies. The immunity group was injected with antibodies and closely monitored to gauge their efficacy. Children simply carried on their day-to-day existence to see if they would still contract the virus. The other group were the unlucky ones. While still given the antibodies, they were deliberately infected with hepatitis. This was either done with direct injection or the drink, a mixture of chocolate milk and infected fecal matter from sick children. Yeah, they really did that. Through experimentation, Krugman learned the amount of the milk needed to cause infection and how long it would take for them to start showing symptoms. Children who managed to recover from the virus were then later reinfected to test for any developed immunities. Krugman looked on as these children suffered, their skin and eyes turning yellow, and them vomiting and refusing to eat. Despite this suffering, Krugman's research was successful. Not only did the experiment drastically speed up the eventual production of a suitable hepatitis vaccine, but helped identify both hepatitis A and B as separate variants. But of course, this didn't stop the criticism. The medical community was completely appalled by Krugman's actions. Although he provided the world with an exceptional discovery and medical progress, he did so while harming his fellow humans, which goes against the medical code of ethics. Paul Offit, a director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, stated that he didn't believe anyone is, quote, ever justified to inoculate a child with an infectious virus that might kill them. Furthermore, famed vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman stated that Krugman's research was, quote, the most unethical medical experiment ever performed on children in the United States. It wasn't until 1972 when Geraldo Rivera, a local investigative reporter, snuck into the Willowbrook school. Inside, he documented the atrociously inhumane living conditions and broadcast them to the world. It was only then did anyone learn the true horrors within the walls. Sure, there were reports in the past, but seeing was believing. Public outcry surrounding unethical experiments like the ones at Willowbrook, as well as the Tuskegee syphilis study, prompted government officials to act. And by 1974, the National Research Act was put into law, requiring any federally funded research involving human subjects to be reviewed and approved by a designated review board. Despite various attempts to refurbish the school, conditions at Willowbrook never improved, leading to its eventual closure in 1987. Krugman, although facing initial backlash for his research, was later praised for his breakthroughs. His past sins were swept under the rug as he became the president of the American Pediatric Society in 1972. He died peacefully several years later in 1995 at the age of 84. Canadians are usually seen in a pretty great light, their morality as high as their house prices, but not everything in their history is all sunshine and syrup. Back in 1942, while the world was going to war over in Europe, Canada had itself quite a domestic display of detrimental dread that would cause suffering for over a decade. The Canadian government was making a push to set nutritional standards across the board for all Canadians, setting a baseline for a healthy and nutritious diet so that little lads and ladies could grow up to be formidable fellas and fellettes. It was around this time that breakthroughs in vitamin and mineral isolation were being made, allowing individual supplements to come to market. So, what's this one called? Oh, that's vitamin A. Huh, vitamin A. Neat. Research surrounding the daily recommended intake amounts of such supplements was critical to give proper recommendations for general public consumption. Not only that, but researchers were curious if these supplements could provide additional health benefits outside of just maintaining normal bodily function. In order to test the true advantages of these nutrients, you needed a night and day comparison, both strong and healthy subjects and malnourished ones. Very malnourished ones. Enter Canadian nutritionist and biochemist Lionel Pett. He heard whispers of severe malnutrition amongst various indigenous populations in the Great White North, particularly in the northern region of the province of Manitoba. He brought along a couple buddies. He had Dr. Percy Moore, a medical superintendent in the Department of Indigenous Affairs, as well as famed nutritionist and pediatrician Dr. Frederick Tisdall. Together, the three men set out to investigate the claims. What they found was nothing short of tragic. To say that these people were starving would be an understatement. The level of malnutrition was crippling. Elders were completely bedridden, children had their growth drastically stunted, and even the able-bodied adults were barely able to function. This led the indigenous population to experience dramatically disproportionate death rates, nearly 52 times the rate of tuberculosis deaths, 8 times the national rate of infant mortality, and 5 times the overall death rate. And that wasn't all. Hunger in the state-sponsored boarding schools for the indigenous children was a constant plague. Thanks to intentional underfunding from the Canadian federal government, these schools were incapable of providing decent food for students. Some schools were noted having no refrigeration or appliances, no basic sanitation, or even trained kitchen staff. School children had no choice but to consume food that was practically inedible. Soggy scraps of bread and old water, rancid bits of meat, and rotting vegetables were the norm. Children were estimated to only be consuming around 1,200 calories a day if they were lucky. That's well below even the bare minimum recommended caloric intake of 1,400 calories a day. Approximately 28% of the girls and 70% of the boys were reported as underweight for their age. But instead of bringing these issues, the very obvious root of school-wide malnutrition to light, Pett, Moore, and Tisdall saw these withering children and thought, "Great, there's our test subjects." And so they got to work. Their goals? Study the negative effects of malnutrition itself and if they could be positively offset by nutrient-fortified foods. Together, the three men gathered data points using over 1,000 indigenous children from several boarding schools across Canada. Blood samples, physical exams, and aptitude tests, all used to establish a baseline across 2 years. 2 grueling years of known malnutrition for the sake of data collection. Imagine doctors coming to your school, seeing you skin and bones, your brown teeth glistening in the incandescent light, and telling you that they're going to help. But in 2 years. Insane. In 1948, Moore and Tisdall began their experimental design. Until Tisdall bit the dust a year later in 1949. He was 55. At the Port Alberni Residential School, students were noticed to have an abnormal riboflavin deficiency as a result of lack of dairy and vegetables. Riboflavin, also known as vitamin B2, helps the body convert food into energy. So the kids were given triple the amount of dairy milk allowance. That's it, just more milk. The Shubenacadie School, crazy name as it is, showed lower measures of ascorbic acid, or vitamin C, in its respective blood sampling. Vitamin C is pretty important for your immune system. Helps prevent you from getting all the icky sickies. Half of these students received vitamin C tablets. The other, placebos. Children at the blood school were pretty low in vitamin B1. Also known as thiamine, vitamin B1 plays a vital role in cellular growth and development. They were given a tasty vitamin B fortified flour. Eat up. Similar to Port Alberni, St. Mary's children also lacked riboflavin, but instead of milk, these kiddos were given a fortified flour containing bone meal, which wasn't even legal for sale under Canadian law. Finally, the very unfortunate students at St. Paul de Métis were left with no changes whatsoever. They were the control group. Sorry guys. Despite the knowledge of the severe lack of quality of nutrition at each and every one of these schools, no additional interventions outside of these supplements were ever made. In fact, many of the staff were actually instructed to withhold any access to dental hygiene for the students, lest it skew their data. None of these children were ever informed that they were being treated as glorified lab rats, nor had any parents ever been told about these experiments. It was all a secret. These experiments lasted for 5 years. 5 years of continued and deliberate malnutrition of children. To no surprise, many died. Even before the experiments, death was prevalent in these schools. And yet, the studies continued, finally concluding in 1953. The results? No breakthroughs, no discoveries, nothing medically valuable that wasn't already known to the healthcare community. Ultimately, the results were inconclusive at best. The suffering was pointless and fruitless. Ashamed of his worthless work, Dr. Percy Moore kept the studies hidden. It wasn't until 2013 when historian Dr. Ian Mosby uncovered the studies and made them public to the world, 60 years after the experiments had ended. Because the research remained hidden for the rest of their lives, both Dr. Pett and Dr. Moore continued to have successful careers, remaining prominent Canadian healthcare figures. Moore died in 1987 from Alzheimer's at the age of 88, and Pett died in 2003 at the age of 93. Probably because he was old as dirt. Harsh criticism came after their work was revealed, sure, but too little, too late. Even in the shadow of a devastating disaster, no one's safe from unethical medical curiosity. On the night of December 3rd, 1984, the city of Bhopal in the Indian state of Madhya Pradesh was in for a rude awakening. A silent death cloud crept across the city, with families abruptly torn from their sleep, aggressively coughing, their eyes inexplicably stinging, and their lungs desperate for fresh air. Within hours, residents fled from their homes to seek refuge, but thousands lay dead in the streets and in their homes. The Bhopal disaster is considered to be one of, if not the, worst industrial accidents in the history of mankind. An accidental release of gaseous methyl isocyanate, a poisonous tearing agent compound, caused the death of nearly 20,000 impoverished Indian civilians, with nearly 2,000 of them being immediate and 8,000 in the following days. This disaster was the result of neglect and underfunding from the Union Carbide Corporation. Various budget cuts to the plant had caused huge gaps in safety and maintenance of chemical production equipment within the facility. Nearly 45 tons of poisonous gas was accidentally released across the city, killing livestock as well as entire families. It's estimated that as many as 500,000 people were directly affected by this disaster. The area surrounding the plant still remains contaminated to this day, even after some half-assed cleaning efforts. Residents living in the area have reported severe health issues years after the incident, many of which being crippling birth defects of those born in the wake of the disaster. As a bit of a band-aid, Union Carbide, the American corporation that owned the plant, paid a modern-day equivalent of $1 billion in compensation in 1989. The Indian government used some of these funds to open the Bhopal Memorial Hospital and Research Center in the late 90s, a hospital which, while open to any needy patient, also provided free medical treatment to any survivors which, at this point, nearly 2 decades later, were in the hundreds. But these survivors would soon be subjected to a new wave of suffering. A caveat made with the construction of the new hospital was that the victims would be studied to determine long-term effects of methyl isocyanate exposure. However, no supporting documentation has ever been found that this research was ever even conducted. Between the years of 2004 and 2008, the hospital was instead commissioned to run several clinical trials funded by various big-name pharmaceutical companies including Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, and Bristol-Myers Squibb. Remember, it wasn't just a hospital, it was also a medical research center. It's right there in the name. The participants? 279 hand-picked patients, 215 of which were victims of the Bhopal gas leak with severe chronic conditions. But why pick them? Well, it's been suggested that since these victims were being treated on the government's dime, they were a bit more disposable. These clinical trials focused on testing various drugs and therapies for any adverse effects in humans. These included gastrosurgery, cardiology, psychiatry, and anesthesiology. Participants, if you could really call them that, were given no informed consent on the matter. One survivor who endured the trials was quoted saying, "They didn't tell me anything about the medicine. When they used to give me the medicine bottle, they used to make me sign a form which I had no clue about." In 2011, investigative journalists discovered and compiled the abhorrent trials in a comprehensive report which you can read in my description below if you're interested. Pfizer focused on antibiotic trials which caused terrible adverse effects. GSK sponsored illegal cardiology trials in collaboration with French pharmaceutical company Sanofi-Aventis. Of the 57 patients in their trials, 5 died. There's evidence to support that at least 10 patients died as a result of these various trials. The companies responsible were found to have been in violation of many of the Nuremberg and Declaration of Helsinki principles. For example, any trial-related deaths must be thoroughly investigated and publicly reported in a timely manner. Some of these deaths weren't reported until months or even years later. Now, there was an ethics committee for the trials, which are supposed to be a third-party, non-biased group responsible for overseeing the ethics of the experiment, but get this, 13 of the 19 committee members were doctors performing the trials. Even the freaking ethics committee was unethical. Despite becoming aware of these very obvious and just completely abysmal red flags, the Drug Controller General of India simply sent a warning note to the hospital, which was basically just a big, "Cut it out, mister." In 2013, outspoken activists and court petitions demanded compensation for the victims of the trials, but of course, none were ever distributed. Gotta love corruption. Sit down, strap in, buckle up, clench your cheeks, and put any food down for this one. This is Dr. Leo Stanley, a real sick son bitch. Born in 1886 to a house of learned doctors, Leo grew up to continue his father's legacy. So in 1913, fresh out of school, gripping his medical degree in his sweaty palm and with little to no surgical experience, Leo became the chief surgeon of the San Quentin prison in, you guessed it, San Quentin, California, the state's oldest prison. Leo's first impressions left much to be desired. The prison was cramped and run down with little to no air circulation, no natural light, and the worst offender of all, according to Leo at least, was the lack of racial segregation. In response, he commissioned a new building, one with fresh air, warm light, and people separated by the color of their skin. Although in a position of responsibility as a healer, Stanley made it very clear that he was the one in charge, leveraging medical attention against bad behavior. Accounts from inmates attest to Leo's apathetic approach to their medical needs. Dwight Myers, who had a reputation as more of a rowdy rascal, had suffered a crushed hand while operating a piece of machinery. Myers was rushed to the medical wing and begged Dr. Stanley for help. "Oh fuck, doctor, we need to get him to surgery." "Hell no, slam him on the table right there, get the bone clipper and get to work." And thus, Dwight was minus one hand and plus one infection. Without anesthesia, by the way. Convicted criminal and ironic name-haver Steve Krim was also known for causing a ruckus on more than one occasion, having been sentenced to solitary confinement multiple times. On one such an occasion, he complained of an agonizing pain in his groinal ball region. Stanley, who didn't give a fickle flying fuck, refused to see Krim. After 3 months in solitary confinement, Krim suffered a brutal ball blast. His scrotum had ruptured. He was sent off to the hospital wing only to be met with indifference from the good doctor. "Well, it's too late to treat it now. What are you, nuts?" "Oh wait, you ain't. Get out of here. You sicken me." Reports of abuse and neglect were prevalent across Stanley's career, but what did he care? He was a medical professional and they were no good scumbag criminals. Well, actually, he did care to some degree. He wanted to figure out what made criminals criminals. You see, Stanley was a proud eugenicist. He was extremely vocal in his beliefs that criminals and other lowly humans should not be allowed to reproduce lest they slop out more human filth like themselves. In fact, during his tenure at San Quentin between 1913 and 1951, Dr. Stanley is known to have performed nearly 1,000 sterilizations, both voluntary and involuntary. He felt verily justified in his actions as he believed he prevented the birth of several would-be criminals. But sterilization was just a band-aid. Dr. Stanley wanted to find the source of the problem. While other researchers at the time subscribed to the Lombrosian theory that pointed to physical characteristics as the reason for criminal behavior, Dr. Leo Stanley proposed another theory, that criminality lies within. Quite literally, Stanley sought to prove that some internal parts of the human body were to blame, that they could be studied to find a commonality across known criminals and differentiate those features from productive members of society. To test this theory, he focused on various endocrine glands found within the body. If you're unaware, an endocrine gland is an organ that excretes different hormones in response to your body's needs. These hormones regulate bodily functions like growth, metabolism, and your mood. Your kidneys, your pancreas, your ovaries, your balls, they're all endocrine glands. He began poking, prodding, and even full-on removing glands from prisoners. Did they consent to the surgery? Maybe. Stanley had claimed multiple times the willingness of his prisoners to be put under the knife. But it was later revealed that most of these prisoners had suicidal and homicidal tendencies, so believe what you will. Stanley noted how one troublesome prisoner, who, upon the removal of the majority of his thyroid, experienced a night-and-day personality switch from disorderly degenerate to a calm and collected compatriot, following rules and routines and having his aggressions completely vanish. Stanley drew inspiration from the studies of Charles Brown-Séquard, the manic Mauritian physiologist who injected himself and others with a concoction of blood and animal testicles as a means of rejuvenation and reversing the aging process. You know, from my immortality video, that guy. Despite that research being widely discredited as a bunch of fucking poppycock, Dr. Stanley decided to give it a chance. He conducted multiple experiments involving the removal of testicles of freshly executed prisoners and slapped them bad boys into the sacks of senile old men with the hope of making them less old and certainly less senile. Surprisingly, it worked. Kind of. While it was reported that older men were soon seen bouncing around with the strength and stamina of their younger peers, it was short-lived. Now, his reports also went into copious detail about how long-term flaccid fellas were suddenly pitching tents all over the place and all the implications surrounding that, but yeah, I'm skipping that part. You see, your balls are the main factory of testosterone, the manly hormone. Grows your muscles, your bones, your hair, and makes you want to ram your rod into anything you find remotely attractive. But the supposed benefits of the tender testicle transfer faded very quickly. But that did not stop the experimentation. Over the course of several years, Stanley continued his ball-swapping surgeries, theorizing that if he discovered the proper procedure, he could bring vitality and sanity back to aging men. Stanley thought that this breakthrough would put him on the forefront of modern medicine, that he could single-handedly rid the world of crime. By 1940, Stanley had performed over 10,000 nut jobs, some of which were, donations made from animals. Goats, rams, boars, and deer junk were just slammed in men's sacks. Some of these prisoners even received a mixture of mashed up man parts which were injected into their bellies. It wasn't until 1941 that the prison found some solace. Stanley shipped himself off with the US Navy to serve in World War II as a lieutenant commander. And after the war, Stanley returned to San Quentin with extreme disappointment. In his absence, the California Department of Corrections instead opted for clinical psychology to address underlying issues of criminality. Turns out, if you just ask someone why they are the way they are, sometimes that gets the job done. Who would have guessed? With the continued advance of both medical ethics and the study of endocrinology, fellow doctors started calling Stanley out on his bullshit, disregarding his work as utter insanity. Completely demoralized, Dr. Leo Stanley retired from the San Quentin prison in 1951. He opened up a quiet private practice for some years, but then died in 1976 at the age of 90. The brutal ballbuster had no kids. Terrifying folklore creatures from around the world. Originating in Southeast Asia, the Krasu is a malevolent female spirit that will truly make you brown your britches something awful. It is described as the floating, disembodied head of a young, beautiful woman, which isn't so bad until you glance down at her iconic trailing organs. A heart, some lungs, a stomach, a liver, intestines, and the rest. All just out in the open, ready to give you a sloppy slap at a moment's notice. A Krasu is believed to be the result of a curse cast upon a young woman who committed horrific atrocities such as infidelity or murder. During the day, a Krasu can walk among humans undetected, appearing as a normal woman, though looking extra super seepy. At night, the Krasu finds a secluded area to detach from her body and fly off into the darkness to feast. They are said to feed on the blood of animals like cows or roadkill, but have a strong appetite for the blood of children, or even better, pregnant women, since it's a 2-for-1 special. After feeding, the Krasu returns to its body before the sun rises to live another day. But fear not, it's pretty easy to protect yourself from them because they aren't exactly invincible. For one, the body that the Krasu leaves behind is what ties it to the world, so if you hide or otherwise destroy it, then the Krasu has nowhere to park its head, leaving it to die an agonizing death once the sun comes up. Another way to go about it is to target the Krasu itself, specifically its dangling intestines, since that's its weak point. If you put up some spiky fences or plants around, the spirit's floppy bits can get entangled, preventing it from being able to return to its body. Or, if you're a Deadeye, you can give them a cinematic send-off. If you ever cross paths with one of these bad boys, consider yourself boned. A Gashidokuro is an evil spirit from Japanese folklore that manifests itself as a skeleton. A 30-foot tall skeleton. It is said to be composed of hundreds of corpses of fallen, forgotten soldiers who have never received their last rites after dying on the battlefield. The residual anger and hatred towards the living fuels this giant rattling rascal to terrorize the countryside in the dead of night. Even though this fella is absolutely huge, the corpse can travel quite quietly and remain undetected. Any humans unlucky enough to cross its path will be crushed and eaten, though if you lack the situational awareness of a 30-foot skeleton approaching you, it's just natural selection. Unfortunately, it is said that the monster is too large and too powerful to defeat and will only come to rest once it has released all of its manifested anger through sheer destruction. But I imagine if you were well equipped with a comically large hammer and took a good thwack at an ankle, you can do some damage. The Naclave is a horse-like demon with origins tied to the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, and is considered to be one of the most evil and most feared spirits in the native folklore. This demonic spirit takes the form of a man mounted on and fused to a horse. Oh yeah, and it has no skin. The humanoid part of the monster possesses a huge head with an incredibly large mouth and a single red eye burning with a red flame. He also has long, ape-like arms that hang at his side. Trust me, if I was actually good at drawing, this would be grade A nightmare fuel. Although the Naclave is said to be a malevolent water spirit originating from the sea, it spends its time wandering the land, spreading plague and disease across crops, livestock, and humans. So anytime that there were problems with crops or natural disasters or anything like that, the Naclave was to blame. Dad, I'm so hungry. I know, son, but that goddamn Naclave done rotted all our food. Fuck you, Naclave! Being a being of pure, unfiltered evil, the Naclave cannot be outright defeated, though it is said that it can't cross bodies of fresh water, so like, find a creek or something and hop over it. Also, I mean, it has no skin, so I don't know, throw some salt and lemon juice at it? That'll probably do the trick. Next, we take a vacation down to the Caribbean with the Sukuyon, an evil spirit, all of these monsters are evil by the way, in case you couldn't tell, that disguises itself as a reclusive old woman during the day, but oh boy, once that sun sets, all hats are off. And so is the Sukuyon's skin. She tosses away her mortal flesh jacket and turns into a fireball, taking off into the night sky to stalk her prey. Oh, you think you're safe indoors? No, see, the Sukuyon can fit through anything to get into your house. A crack in the door, a crack in the floor. She can even get in through your windows and more. But what does a Sukuyon do? She may drink your blood or try to turn you. And if she has her way, there's no chance she can win, for the Sukuyon might just end up wearing your skin. But a way to defeat her would serve you quite nice, so distract her using a handful of rice. Throw it on the ground, then turn and flee. For each grain she must count carefully. Locate her old skin and cover it with salt. Now her evil deeds have come to a halt. If these rhymes gave you a good vibe, always remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Stemming from Central American folklore, the Siwanaba is an absolute babe. She's described as a stunningly attractive, long-haired woman. She is usually seen wearing thin, see-through clothing, which I guess I can't complain too much. You might find her alone at night around water sources such as a river or a lake, usually washing clothes or bathing. Well, being the big macho man you are, you're not going to let this opportunity pass you by, so you puff out your chest and make your move.
Excuse me, babe, I couldn't help but notice you washing your clothes in a very secluded part of the river alone on this eerie moonless night. Can I be of assistance, my lady? Damn, babe, I'm gonna have to break out the special equipment. There you go. That'll work.
Although the Siwanaba do be looking good from behind, it possesses a demonic horse face, which is a deal breaker to most men. Those unfortunate enough to cross its path are often driven mad by its shocking appearance or instantly die of fear when her face is revealed. But if you ever find yourself in the presence of what you think is a Siwanaba, you may banish it by making the sign of the cross with your fingers. And if that doesn't work, she might not be a Siwanaba at all, in which case, just tell her you're not really all that interested. Now this one is the stuff of nightmares. Literal nightmares. An Alp is the OG sleep paralysis demon. They are described as small elf-like demons from Germanic folklore that climb into your room at night and sit on your chest as you sleep. These little bastards just stay perched up on your sternum, restricting your breathing and not allowing you to move or wake up, causing terrifying nightmares. Talk about sleep apnea. Alpen apparently have the ability to shapeshift into multiple animals such as a cat, a dog, a pig, or even a snake. So the next time you wake up with your cat on your face, it might just be a small demon. The way you can tell an Alp apart from your pet is its stupid looking hat. This is called a tarn cap, which grants the demon powers, including the ability to become invisible when worn. But don't worry, you can get rid of these little annoying buggers with some simple tricks, which include sticking a broomstick under your pillow, hanging iron horseshoes on your bedpost, placing your shoes against your bed with the toes pointing toward your door, placing a mirror on your chest, hanging steel crosses around the room. You can also bargain with the Alp, asking it to come back in the morning for coffee. It will scurry away and return in the morning to claim its prize. Take this opportunity to cave its frontal lobe in with a solid oak plank. Problem solved. Back to bed. If you're going to be executed, you'd probably want the process to be relatively quick and painless, be it one fell swoop from the guillotine, a short drop and a sudden stop, or just getting injected with night-night juice. But sometimes, things don't go according to plan. So let's see how it all went wrong for a few poor unfortunate souls. If you're getting your melon chopped off, you're going to want two things, a sharp blade and a trained executioner. Poor Margaret Pole got maybe one of those. Once the very wealthy Countess of Salisbury, not the steak, Margaret fell from the good graces of King Henry VIII when she went all girl boss on him for divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry brushed this off, but was set over the edge when Margaret's very influential Catholic cardinal son, Reginald Pole, also scolded him, but from a safe distance over in Italy.
Hey Henry, you suck!
The proud Protestant king responded, being all right, bet, and imprisoned Margaret, Reginald, and the rest of her family in the Tower of London.
That'll teach you.
Margaret was held for 2.5 years in the Tower in actually pretty fair conditions, with her own personal servants and lavish clothing, until one morning when she got a surprise visitor. Hey Margaret, how's it going? You look great, by the way. I love that dress. So listen, yeah, you're gonna be executed today. Okay, bye. That morning on May 27th, 1541, Margaret was led to a courtyard to have her dome knocked off. Unfortunately for her, the main executioner had been sent away to fight some rebels, so his intern filled in. Generally, executions are supposed to be swift and smooth. Not this one. The inexperienced executioner couldn't chop worth shit, so he ended up just hacking Margaret's back and neck to bits. Oops. 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 It took 11 swings to finally detach head from body. Now, if you're going to be executed, you might as well have done something pretty cool to deserve it. Take Robert Francois Damier, for example. As a very French man, he hated his very French king, King Louis XV, because reasons. Well, in 1757, he decided to channel that hatred into something productive, like developing an elaborate plan to kill the king. As the merry monarch was entering his carriage at the Palace of Versailles, Damier mashed the A button to rush past the bodyguards and stab the king with a penknife. Fortunately for King Louis, his thick-ass royal king coat was thick enough to stop the pen from doing any severe damage, and the pen only penetrated less than half of an inch into his chest, causing nothing but a flesh wound. Damier was immediately arrested, convicted, and sentenced to be drawn and quartered by horses. Now, if you're unfamiliar with such an execution method, it's exactly as it sounds. No, not that. There we go. A rope is tied around each limb and strapped to a horse. 4 limbs, 4 horses. They then pull in opposite directions until your limbs pop out of their sockets one by one. Real fun stuff. Well, that's how it's supposed to go. Reportedly, Damier had stubborn anatomy that just refused to separate at all. So, to make things a little bit easier, his arms and legs had their tendons cut to make the ripping easier. After his last limb detached, he was reported to have still been alive, so his stumpy, bloody torso was burned to finish the job. Bit overkill for a little scratch with a penknife, but whatever. Thomas Ketchum, who has no relation to the world-famous Pokemon trainer, was an infamous American outlaw who would give Arthur Morgan a run for his money.
Quack, quack.
Ketchum, also known as Black Jack, had his own posse of cowboys for some rootin', tootin', robbin', and shootin'. Ketchum and his gang terrorized the Wild West in the late 1800s with a string of shootouts, robberies, murders, but they had bigger ambitions with heftier payouts. That's when Tom decided to go for gold. Literal gold. On trains. He was gonna rob trains. With his brother Sam at his side, the two robbed trains to the tune of a modern-day equivalent of a few $1 million over the years. But eventually, their luck ran out. On a solo run, Sam was injured in a shootout, arrested, and died of an infection of his wounds a few days later. Tom, unaware that his brother just bit the dust robbing a train, made an attempt on the very same train just a month later. At this point, the train conductor's a little sick of getting robbed, so he pulled an Uno reverse card on Tom, using a shotgun to blast away his elbow. The train chugged away and Tom was left injured on the wayside, where he was later arrested by law enforcement. For his countless crimes over the years, Tom was sentenced to death by hanging. Unfortunately for Tom, though, the small New Mexico town had no experience actually hanging a man, so they did the best they could. Gallows? Check. Prisoner? Check. Length of hanging rope? I don't know. The gallows were tested with a 200-pound sack of flour, which seemed to have been successful. But the problem here is that the same rope that was tested was reused for the execution, so that 200-pound sack made the rope really tight. Since Tom was notorious at this point, crowds flocked to witness his execution. On April 26, 1901, the rope was placed around Tom's neck and the trapdoor was sprung. The townsfolk ended up getting way more than they bargained for. The long, tight rope instantly decapitated Tom once he reached the apex of his final descent. He should have quit, but now he's just ahead. But at least he made a cool postcard. Hey, quick side note here. So I'm realizing that there's like no image resources for this section, so I hope you don't mind some crude artwork. King Cal Lorso, GL, was the second woman in Thai history to be put to death by gunfire. Being a nanny to the 6-year-old son of a wealthy business family, she was promptly fired because... But that didn't sit too well with her. In a desperate attempt to get some money, she, along with several accomplices, had kidnapped the 6-year-old for ransom. They had demanded 200,000 Thai baht, or $6,000, for the release of the boy. After the terrified family failed to follow the exact directions of where to bring the ransom money, the young boy was brutally beaten and buried alive. GL had attempted to save the boy with whom she had grown fond of, but failed to do so. GL and her accomplices were quickly arrested and sentenced to death by firing squad. Now, Thailand did firing squads a bit different from what you'd expect. Instead of lining a blindfolded prisoner to a wall with several gunmen taking aim, the prisoner is instead tied facing backward on a wooden cross. A concealing screen is put up with a target pointing in the vicinity of the prisoner's heart, and a rifle is lined up to the target. A single executioner is instructed to fire up to 15 shots at the target, guaranteeing the prisoner's death. On January 13, 1979, GL was executed and carted off to the morgue, and all seemed to have been successful. But that thought quickly evaporated once GL was found screaming her frickin' head off in the morgue and attempting to stand up. But why wasn't the execution successful, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you if you just wait a minute. Jeez. It turns out that GL's genetics played a prank on her. She was diagnosed with situs inversus, meaning that all of her organs were mirrored to how they normally should be, with her heart on her right side of her chest rather than her left. So those initial shots all missed her heart entirely, and instead of killing her, just ended up hurting a lot. She was instantly pulled from the morgue, set up once more on the cross, and given another volley of justice seeds to the back. When it comes to new inventions, they usually go through rigorous testing and tweaks to perfect their function before being put on the market for commercial use. Well, since the electric chair wasn't a commercial product, who cares? Improvements can be made later on once enough testing is performed. William Kemmler was such a test subject. A poor businessman and a drunk, Kemmler often found himself in trouble. According to an article in the New York Times, on March 29, 1889, Kemmler was recovering from a drinking binge the night before when he became enraged with his wife, Tilly Ziegler. He accused her of stealing from him and preparing to run away with a friend of his. When the argument had reached a peak, Kemmler calmly went to the barn out back, grabbed a hatchet, and returned to the house. He struck Tilly repeatedly, killing her. He then went to a neighbor's house and announced that he had just murdered his wife. Kemmler was arrested, swiftly convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to be executed by a brand new invention. On August 6, 1890, Kemmler was brought to the chair. He reportedly did not resist in any way and willingly accepted his punishment. After being secured and wishing everyone farewell, the switch was thrown. 1,000 volts were put through Kemmler's body for 17 agonizing seconds. Kemmler was unconscious, but alive. The voltage was doubled and power was thrown again. This is where things became spectacular. It was reported by witnesses that Kemmler's blood vessels ruptured and bled under his skin and his entire body caught fire. The entire execution room filled with the foul odor of burning flesh, causing many witnesses to panic and flee. The execution lasted 8 terrifying minutes. An autopsy showed that Kemmler's skull had burnt to a crisp and his brain cooked to a tender medium rare.
It looks stunning.
The New York Times later published a review stating that the executioner would have done better with an axe. What do you mean you're out of breadsticks?
Freshly grated Parmesan, sir.
Oh, yes, please.
Very good, sir. Just say when.
Alright, but it's gonna be a while. Oh, no. Here we go again with the witch and such. You really should have taken better precautionary measures. Oh well. This time, you're being lobbed into ancient Rome, a civilization that, apparently, is always on the mind of any male over the age of 20. But for you, you'll get to live it. Or at least try to. Let's see what you're capable of, shall we? You arrive in the year 250, right in the middle of the ominously named Crisis of the 3rd Century, a tumultuous time of terrible turmoil which began a while back in 235 after Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated. Classic Roman Emperor move. After being confronted by Germanic invaders, he, with some influence from his mother, came to the conclusion that violence was not the answer. Instead, he would pay off the invaders to frig off back home. What a great idea, Severus thought. It was not. In response, Emperor Alexander's most trusted military generals didn't appreciate seeing potential funding go to would-be invaders. So, they made a direct deposit of a knife into the emperor's neck. With interest. With him out of the way, the Roman Empire kind of fell on hard times, as empires tend to do when their emperors are killed off. New emperors were coming and going like one-night stands, the military became fractured and weakened thanks to countless civil wars and a struggle for power, and divided empire states took their chances at yoinking some lesser protected land for themselves. All really chaotic stuff, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, here you are, smack dab in the middle of Rome. Actually, you've landed in the Amphitheatrum Flavium, but you might know it as the Colosseum, a spectacular stadium of spectacle where performances like dramatic theater, gladiator battles, and prisoner executions, among other things, took place across hundreds of years. But thanks to defunding and failed upkeep because, yeah, the empire's in crisis mode, events were a lot more rare in the Colosseum during these times. So you're probably good to just leave and... Oh. That's a big guy. You can tell by how big he is. Just look at those muscle veins, the chest hair, the menacing look. Huh, terrifying. Let's see what he has to say.
Alios me provocare audit bellator.
I don't know what you just said.
O portet legere verba.
Oh yeah.
Pugna me bellator. Con prova divitato.
Okay.
Elige divitello.
All right. Let's advertise. Rule 1. The first strike is always precise. Rule 2. The second strike always finishes smooth.
Fabulous sunt vera. Is sentio omnino. Ineluctabilite. Ceres.
Well dang, those are some smooth moves you got there. That was a pretty decent fight with a pretty decent loot drop. But now we have to shift from fantasy to reality. The struggles of ancient Rome were very real. Disease, poverty, and constant war were a daily concern. Do you think you can handle a day-to-day life during one of the most difficult and dangerous times of the Roman Empire? Not like that you aren't. You have to remember that witch interrupted your spaghetti dinner, so you're gonna need to find some food. Traditionally, the Roman diet consisted of a variety of fruits, vegetables, grains, and meats, but you're in the middle of a crisis which includes agriculture. This means that food supply is on the fritz. Some farms have too little water, some farms have too much water. This is too much water! Even fewer have it just right, so food's getting a little scarce. Thanks to widespread civil wars across the empire, many regions have also had their trade routes disrupted, so what little food choices you have are restricted to your immediate area. This of course led to mass malnutrition across the empire, well, mainly for the poor anyway. Thankfully, the capital of the Roman Empire is able to provide some basic sustenance, for a price. So what's on the menu? As for vegetables, you have some choice of greens: parsley, peppers, cabbages and celery, asparagus and watercress and artichokes and lettuce, which is alright for just a quick bite, but you're a dude who needs better food to set you right. Maybe a fig, or maybe some dates, some apples or cherries or peaches or grapes? Bread's for sure, there's some here to eat, just don't get your hopes up if you're looking for some meat. Weather and war have fucked up the supply, so these are pretty much all your choices, my guy. Beggars can't be choosers, but I beg you to choose. Survival is the game that you don't want to lose. And if you're looking for a drink to imbibe, have some watered down wine. You should also subscribe. Sorry, got lost in a rhyme scheme there. Anyway, time to make a purchase. Luckily, you have some gold from your previous altercation, and it's plenty to get you by for now, but it doesn't buy what it used to. See, the emperors, in all of their untold wisdom, needed money in the coffers to pay off incredible debts from beefing up the military and keeping peace with foreign entities. In order to do that, they chose to, among other things, devalue the currency by minting coins with lesser and lesser composition of precious metals. This inevitably caused rapid inflation, which is disturbing from both an economic and a fetish standpoint. Hey son, you watching more of them funny history videos? Go to your room. Since you have the cash monies, time to consume some nutrients. Problem is, you're an outsider, and unless you're fluent in the dead language of Latin, you're in a pickle, but you try to communicate with what little knowledge you have of the Latin language. Wingardium Leviosa? Well, that didn't work. You go up to the next vendor and instead just point to what you want. Why speak when your money can do the talking? Nimis pecunium. Yeah, thanks, you too. Hup. Alright, now you... Oh no. Your body isn't used to consuming all of that ancient food. Looks like you need to go do some business. In a bit of a sweaty, stinky panic, you manage to find a public restroom. Ugh, it reeks in here. Don't these people have any sense of... Welcome to the Forica, also known as the community turlet. Several holes carved into long, cold marble slabs, perfect for slamming your ass on and expelling your evils. Usually hooked up to a public bath, excess bath water would run along the floor to flush away your densely digested duty poos to a public sewer system. If you were lucky enough to have it actually attached to one. Sure, you could be like them rich folk with their own private bathrooms, but you're not. So instead, you have to make bears with the bros, and you're gonna have to get real friendly cause as you may have observed, there's no toilet papyrus to speak of. No, instead, you're gonna have to ask Claudius here to share the community wiping tool. It's just a sea sponge on a stick. Once you've done cleaning your nethers, be sure to rinse it off in the shallow trough in front of you for the next guy. That's just common courtesy. Now, being a public bathroom and all, you could expect that these places were not the cleanest, and you'd be correct. Excessive buildup of waste not only led to widespread disease, but also dangerous levels of methane. Ugh, Claudius, light a match, dude. Let's try the bath instead. Public baths in the Roman Empire, called thermae, were actually pretty sweet. Available to anyone who wanted a nice refreshing dunk, these bathing complexes were a social gathering spot. They included exercise areas, steam rooms, and sometimes even libraries when you want to read a soggy book. Problem is, you're in a stagnant bath that doesn't get cleaned all that often, and hundreds of Romans use these baths every day, not to mention the fact that there isn't a bar of soap in sight. Romans didn't have soap. Instead, cleaning was done with this monstrosity. The strigil, a bronze tool used to scrape off the day's or week's grit and grime. Just be a little cautious when using it. In order to smell nice, Romans would apply scented olive oils all throughout their nooks and crannies. But now everyone's all slippery and oiled up, so watch your step. With all of that muck just soaking in the water, it's debatable how clean you actually got. Looks like all the Christians are moving in and telling everyone to cover up. What losers. Anyway, let's shimmy on down the road. Just keep your eyes to the skies for any other citizens who are emptying their festering chamber pots into the street. It's gonna be raining cats and logs. Oh yeah, you're definitely gonna be catching some sort of... I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that an overcrowded and filthy city tends to be riddled with disease. Just look at modern LA. When it came to ancient Rome, the most common diseases were influenza and tuberculosis, as well as some STDs, but you're a good person who's waiting for marriage or proper emotional or monetary compensation before you explore that route, right? Right, so despite these common diseases, Rome would often be smacked in the face with various plagues. The term plague here meaning big, bad, unknown disease that killed a lot of people. They were plagues, just not the plague. This one is the Plague of Cyprian, named so after the Bishop Cyprian who wrote about the plague in fine detail, especially the symptoms. He wrote that the plague caused exhaustive diarrhea, a swollen and sore throat, constant vomiting, bloodshot eyes, loss of infected and putrefied limbs, paralysis, deafness, and blindness. All of these symptoms add up to one dead fella. Because of the bizarre symptoms, which don't point to any one known disease in particular, historians are still unsure what this plague actually was, but some suspect either the Ebola virus or smallpox. Regardless, the Plague of Cyprian devastated the Roman Empire. At its height, the plague was estimated to be killing off about 5,000 Romans a day. This crushed the Roman military, opening up opportunities for possible invasions, which of course would crush the Roman military even more. Local farms were abandoned, and since trade routes were still cut off due to internal clashes, famine became the new hot commodity. Entire cities saw rapid declines in population, the most notable being the city of Alexandria, Egypt. It sustained a 62% drop in population between the years of 249 and 262. This was caused by citizens either fleeing or dying, or both. So it looks like tons of people are leaving Rome. This can't be good. You're also down to your last few gold oh yeah, crime's a thing. Oh well, I'm sure that guy will get what's coming to him.
Stop!
Well, now you're just straight up out of money. Looks like you need to get a job. And you know what's hiring the most right now? The military. So you go up to a local guard and you ask them to join. I join as militum? Yeah, sure. Success! The guard gives you a quick once-over to make sure that you're cut out for the job. In order to join the ranks of the Roman military, you needed to meet some criteria. You must have been at least 5'7", between the ages of 17 and 23, and physically fit. Oh yeah, and a guy. Sorry ladies, you're not allowed to die for the Empire, just with it. Welcome to the military. Now, when you imagine a Roman soldier, you might think of this kind of a guy. This is a centurion, a highly trained and high-ranking commander, which is something that you'll never be. Instead, your aspiration should be lowered to that of a typical foot soldier. Sure, it's not as glorious, but these were the muscle of the Roman military. After months and months of rigorous and extremely taxing training, including combat and unit formation, you've been given the privilege of being javelin fodder for the Roman Empire. Here's your complimentary gear, generously provided by the taxpayers. Your primary weapon is your trusty gladius, a 24-inch steel short sword. Your secondary is your pugio, a wide flat-bladed dagger for when you want to remind your enemies of personal space. You're also given a pilum, a pretty sweet javelin, and it does this. Pretty neat, huh? It was kind of designed to be a one-and-done type weapon, used to pierce enemy armor or get stuck in their shields, rendering them useless. Typically, a pilum weighed about 2 to 5 pounds, so they were pretty easy to lob at the enemy. As for armor, foot soldiers in the 3rd century typically wore lorica hamata, a bronze and iron chainmail shirt which offered great protection against slashes and cuts, just not so much against the stabbing. In addition, you were given a scutum, a large wooden round shield for protection against projectiles impairing the enemy so you can scoot them back. You also have to protect your dome, so make sure you grab a helmet. In addition to protecting your melon, these also protected the back of your neck as well as your precious cheeks with tieable cheek guards. Now, you're ready to fight. Time to head west to the front lines. Since it's the year 250, the Roman Empire faces a terrifying foe. The Goths. truly barbaric people that have the gall to invade the Roman Empire. For the sake of brevity, they hate you because they ain't you, so their goal is to take everything you have, just as long as they're back in time for their moms to pick them up from the mall. You spot one of their many headquarters in the distance, but you'll never break through their front line, unless you're able to build up enough speed, but how? There! Can you do this? Yes, you have to. For the Empire. You carefully position yourself, you turn around, and... Oops, wrong angle. Just say when's, So you really clicked this video, huh? Alright, here's some cruel execution methods. Ever had like a hot burrito or something, and you take a bite and you're like, ow, this is hot. Well, imagine that, but many magnitudes worse. And even that wouldn't even begin to describe the agony of having molten metal poured down your throat. Created out of ironic symbolism, this method of execution was reserved for those who truly needed to swallow their pride. Take, for example, the wealthy Roman commander Manius Achilles. His papa, also named Manius, was a ruthless and greedy governor that forced harsh taxes on the general public. Well, like father, like son, said the people, fully expecting Manius Jr. to become a greedy butthole himself. That's one heck of an assumption to make, but condemning people to death for fun was kind of the thing to do in ancient Rome. After suffering defeat at the hands of Anatolian ruler Mithridates the Great during the First Mithridatic War in the year 89 BC, Manius was captured and eventually executed. When picking a suitable method to send Manius into the Great Bed Bath & Beyond, he really decided to go for the gold. Yeah, he just dumped melted metal down Manius's food hole as a testament to his greed and thirst for power. So what the heck does ingesting molten metal do to the human body? Not good things. Not good things at all. Molten gold sits at around 1000 degrees Celsius, so the instant that the metal contacts the flesh, it will instantly vaporize any inherent moisture into steam. In doing so, the metal will cool and harden, essentially creating a big metal plug in your throat, causing suffocation. Now here's a science lesson for you today.
Science lesson!
When liquids evaporate to a gas, they expand very quickly. Rapid expansion in a closed system like, say, your body, creates severe pressure. Considering that your internal organs are not built for said extreme pressures, you can probably see where this causes a problem. But don't worry, it sorts itself out rather quickly because your organs rupture. The good news is that you'd probably pass out and die before you even get to the point of having your internals turn into a 4th of July display. Immurement is just a fancy word for live entombment, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's one of those punishments that introverts would be like, oh hell yeah dude, until they realize that they can't go downstairs to get more Doritos, and that they're just probably gonna die in there. And if you've ever played Minecraft with your buddies, you probably experienced immurement firsthand when you came back to your room after mommy gave you your Ritalin. The practice was, unsurprisingly, mainly performed in the Roman Empire, but it has been seen in other areas like ancient Persia or Mongolia. Man, who do they put in charge of coming up with all these execution ideas?
I love my job.
This signature send-off method was usually reserved for virgin priestesses who were found guilty of breaking their chastity vows by getting on their knees and praying on some dong. However, there is historical evidence to suggest that it was used in other ways too, like mass entombment for prisoners of war, a punishment for thieves, or even just silly self-sacrificing fellers who voluntarily walled themselves in for religious purposes. Or just because they don't like people.
Yeah, fuck off!
So yeah, all those poor unfortunate souls would be sealed in a room no bigger than a New York apartment, while the lucky ones were placed in something a little bit more reasonable. Being completely sealed in means there's no light, no sound, or fresh air. So don't Dutch oven yourself.
Damn it!
Being isolated, you're just left to lose your goddamn mind in complete darkness and silence as your body wastes away from starvation and dehydration. Unless, of course, you accidentally trip over a rock and whack your melon on the stone wall. Trees are pretty useful. They convert carbon dioxide into oxygen, can be used for building materials, and can even help you execute your enemies. Oh, you didn't know that last one? Well, let me explain. Sure, you could convert your enemies to a cool wind chime on a tree, but why not go all out? That's what Roman Emperor Aurelian thought, at least. Being emperor and all, Aurelian was a bit of a control freak. He demanded only the finest behavior from his numerous army soldiers. That being the case, any thoughts of drinking, gambling, stealing, pillaging, and, all the stuff soldiers typically did were tossed out the window. Every man was expected to be in tip-top shape with their armor polished and their weapons sharp at a moment's notice. So it was just an army of a bunch of lame straight-edge dorks. Bit of a buzzkill, right? Those who refused to follow such protocols were setting themselves up for some severe punishment, and not even the kind that some people would find fun. Except this guy. For example, one soldier decided to have a fellow soldier's wife polish his spear in private. But the spear was his wiener, and in Aurelian's all-seeing perverted eyes, that's a big no-no, and now he had to make a choice. How was he going to make an example of this man to his fellow soldiers? Well, any good leader is resourceful, so why not harness the power of Mother Nature to do the trick? Oh look, 2 trees.
What are you gonna do with those? Tie me to each one and have them rip me apart? That is what he's gonna do.
As a reasonable punishment, the soldier had his limbs strapped to 2 young trees which were forced into a bent, crossed position. Once released, the spry, springy saplings did a solid conversion of potential energy to kinetic energy, ripping the soldier in 2 and giving visual confirmation that a lesson had been learned. Hey, what's cooking? Oh, it's me. Well, I must have been a bad boy, because getting boiled alive was generally reserved for those who were guilty of murder. But the only thing I'm guilty of is killing some brewskis, am I right, fellas? Okay. Used in medieval Europe as far back as 1392, boiling alive was the choice punishment for other crimes as well. Treason, forgery, counterfeiting, thievery, grape without the G, swindling, you name it. Even the Japanese were on the hot topic of boiling their criminals. Legendary thief and Robin Hood equivalent Ishikawa Goemon was boiled alive with his son in 1594 after they tried to assassinate a warlord. I mean, what did you think would happen? Even though it's pretty straightforward, humans have found different ways to make boiling someone alive more entertaining. For instance, what liquid is being used? Water's great and all, but that's as boring as it gets. So instead, use something with a little more oomph, like oil or tar. Now here's another quick science lesson. Another science lesson! Water, as I'm sure you know, boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Sorry fellow Americans, we're working with metric today, but you'll still get the point. Once a liquid reaches a boiling point, the liquid cannot physically get any hotter in normal atmospheric conditions, so it vaporizes to a gas. So in a sense, you hit a limit of pain able to be inflicted on your victim. No need to worry though, because you can always upgrade your cauldron juice. You see, oil has an average boiling point of 200 degrees Celsius, and tar can get up to 500 degrees. And when it's that hot, you'll easily be able to melt skin right off your victim like some tender baby back ribs from Chili's. Another way you can get creative is how you want to boil your prisoner. Want to just huck them in, slowly lower them, or how about you just have them sit in there as it heats up? There's definitely a small window in there where it actually feels nice for a bit, then the boiling happens, and that can get pretty hard to watch. Hey, do you think we should—
Hold up. Let him cook.
Now here's where we get down to the real gruesome stuff, but this time the Romans are left to the wayside. Now we swing our attention to the Norse, like the Vikings. They were pretty tame people, right? Right, from around the year 800 to 1100 in Northern Europe, the Vikings were adamant explorers that would often pick fights with people that they thought they could conquer. Which was pretty much everyone, even themselves. They raided and pillaged and plundered in the name of their many gods under the polytheistic Old Norse paganism. Although a relatively barbaric and fierce warrior people, the Vikings did have laws to abide by. Insults and petty crimes were punishable by humiliations like public tarring and feathering, but the heavier the crime, the heavier the punishment. Cheat on your spouse? Lose a limb. Stole from a neighbor? Now you're their slave. Caught in a lie? Well, time to carry around hot burning coals for a while. All is well and good, but no punishment was as severe as the Blood Eagle. Being an execution, of course the goal is death, but might as well make it as agonizing as possible to really send a message like, hey, don't do bad things. This could be you. Although it was rarely performed, the Blood Eagle went like this. The first thing you're going to want to do is have your victim laying flat on their tummy like so. Then give them a nice pat on the back to reassure them that everything is going to be absolutely terrible. Get a nice sharp knife and plunge it into the back and pull through the flesh, exposing the spine. Next, you're going to want to start breaking each one of these little ribs here. Give your chiropractics a try and just give them a nice, good crack. Oh, hear that? Yeah. That's what we're looking for. Now, just bloom those nice ribs out like a fresh flower. As a finishing touch, grab both lungs, don't worry, he won't be needing them, and rip them out so they loosely resemble wings. And there you have it, one blood eagle.
Please subscribe.
Oh boy, scaphism, also called the boats. This was by no means a pleasure cruise. Imagine you're on a nice relaxing fishing trip with your dad. You're having a good time, he's having a beer, you're getting a few nibbles here and there, he's having another beer. You're excited about what kind of fish you might catch to make your old man proud, he's on his 10th beer, and then you start to realize something. Your dad couldn't be there because your parents had a messy divorce decades ago and he didn't get any visitation rights because of his extreme alcoholism. After that, you never saw him again until you buried him. You're alone in this boat. How long's it been? Days? Must be. You look down and you see your body in ruin. Open sores with flies and rats tearing at your flesh. You're festering in your own filth, and the infection is spreading. You can't even feel it anymore. You can't feel anything anymore. Except that sun, that hot sun. Baking. Broiling. You look to the sky once more and there, you see him again. You want to reach out, but your hands are restrained. I'm ready, you say, with all the strength you have left. Hi, Reddy, he says. I'm Dad. That's kind of what it was like to experience scaphism. Even without a tragic backstory, it was a pretty painful experience. Developed by the Persians around 500 BC, a victim sentenced to the boats would be tied down facing up in a boat. Sometimes there would even be a second boat placed on top, sealing the victim's body except for their head, hands, and feet, which were tied down. The victim would be force-fed and covered in honey and moo juice until they vomited from their front hole and their back hole. The boat would be cast adrift in a pond and left out in the sunlight. Over time, the foul odors attracted swarms of insects and rodents that would feast on the victim for days. The victim eventually passes away from infection, blood loss, dehydration, or starvation. One account had a soldier survive 17 days before finally succumbing to his wounds. Brutal. Secret government conspiracies. Alright fellas and fellettes, let's kick this off with something silly. Way back in the late 90s, when my biggest problems were nothing more than navigating the Ocarina of Time water temple and keeping my Neopets from starving, the rest of the world had real problems, like nuclear problems. Big nuclear bomb problems. The biggest players in the nuclear game were Russia and the United States. A small handful of countries had their own too, but they weren't taken too seriously. In order to keep things relatively peaceful, both the US and Russia agreed to minimize their nuclear stockpile and stop irradiating random corners of the globe. Now everyone could sleep soundly knowing that it was far less likely for someone's sweaty little fingy to be hovering over a launch button at any given moment. But what if a less friendly country developed the technology themselves and used it as a last resort to end life as we know it? Your best move would be to proactively prevent that development, or at least severely hinder it. Well, that's exactly what the US tried to do in 1999 when it developed Operation Merlin, a covert CIA operation aimed at sabotaging any possible nuclear weapons development programs in foreign countries, specifically Iran. Why Iran? Simple. They don't like the US and the US doesn't like them. But what do you expect given the fact that the US overthrew the Iranian government in 1953 because of oil? Fast forward to the 90s and trade sanctions and terrorism have caused both countries to put them on edge. But the Iranian government wasn't dumb. They knew full well that a nuclear warhead or 10 would quickly convert their country into a glass parking lot. So in order to level the playing field as well as any opposing military, they would need to develop their own weapons of mass destruction. So whispers of an Iranian nuclear program began to make their way over to the States. No concrete evidence, of course, just a hunch. But just the fear that Iran would develop its very own shiny nukes and gain a seat at the big kids table was enough motivation to intervene. Hey, nice missile.
Don't touch.
Which brings us back to Operation Merlin. Now the plan here was to have US nuclear warhead blueprints accidentally make their way into the hands of Iranian officials. These plans, however, were sabotaged, sprinkled with tidbits of completely wrong information designed to mislead Iranian researchers down a rabbit hole of designing inherently flawed weapons. Imagine you were taking a complicated test. With just 5 minutes left, you realize, oh no, there's a back page. Your blood runs cold as your pupils quiver in fear. Your pores pour profound portions of perspiration from pecs to pelvis. Just then, a soft sound licks your wax-impacted eardrum. Psst, here, your classmate yells. He hands you an answer sheet. You blush blushingly. With this presumably correct information, you manage to finish the test. And then you explode. Alright, that might not be the best analogy, but you get the idea. In order to actually carry out the plan, the CIA needed the delivery boy, which came in the form of a freshly defected Russian nuclear scientist. Plenty of those walking around thanks to the USSR just having recently bath-bombed away. This scientist would be given the flawed blueprints to a TBA-480 high-voltage neutron initiator. Basically, a nuclear bomb's firing pin. The blueprints would be sold to the Iranian government under the guise that they were stolen. But here's the problem. A lot of the details of the operation were on a need-to-know basis. Well, you'd think that the fella actually handling the plans would be given most of that information. He wasn't. In reality, the scientist was only given instruction to sell the plans to Iran, and he didn't know that the designs had been tampered with. So when he went to review the blueprints himself, he noticed some issues. Blueprints wrong. I fix. Yeah, in an innocent act of good faith, the scientists had ironed out the design flaws and proceeded to hand over the now correct blueprints to the Iranian government, unintentionally thwarting the US's whole operation.
You what?
That's right, the American attempt to derail the Iranian nuclear program had completely backfired and may have actually helped their nuclear research in the long run. But it has to be said that Iran is not known to possess any nuclear weapons in the current day, as far as we know. The only reason we know about Operation Merlin is thanks to former CIA officer Jeffrey Sterling, who leaked information about the mission to a New York Times journalist in 2003. He got a 3.5-year prison sentence for that little stunt. Operation Mockingbird should be no surprise to anyone, especially nowadays. A couple of years after the end of the critically acclaimed sequel to World War I, previously alive President Harry Truman established the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, for the sake of upholding American national security. And by national security, this meant just shooting ropes of American influence across the globe to protect American interests. Interests that would soon be threatened by the Soviet Union. Having just fought side by side as allies in World War II, both the US and the USSR quickly turned on each other thanks to ideological differences, thus kickstarting the Cold War. The USSR scrambled to establish a geopolitical foothold in now German unoccupied territories across Eastern Europe. You are German now. Okay. Now you Soviet. Alright. Not only did this grant the USSR expanded access to natural resources, but it also provided a sort of Ferris sheet, if you will, of communist countries around the motherland's Western Front. The United States, having just witnessed the abhorrent conditions under Stalin's totalitarian control, was all absolutely not, and sought to prevent any of that smelly communist influence from leaking across the rest of Europe. Alright, which one looks better? No, come on, Poland. Focus. But the very last thing the US needed was to have communistic influence take root and grow from within. So in order to stamp out that possibility, the US government needed to remind Americans just how good they had it. Capitalism good, communism bad. Enter Operation Mockingbird, a covert CIA operation designed with the goal of steering public opinion away from any communist influence. But a direct in-your-face approach wouldn't do the trick. This needed to be more subtle and appear to be coming from multiple trusted sources. The more widespread the idea, the easier it is to believe. Now you have to admit, the general population is easily swayed. That's why political campaigns work. But back in the 1950s or so, access to information was nowhere near what it is today. So many messages were taken at face value by the vast majority of Americans. If you heard from your favorite news sources that millions had died under Stalin's communist regime and that communism was spreading to the US, you're gonna shit a brick. If your favorite movies portrayed communists as evil little minions who want to steal your freedoms, you're gonna be one pissed off Polly. The only good commie is one that ain't alive no more. I'll work on that later. There's probably no better way to control the masses than by fear and anger. Under Operation Mockingbird, the CIA had infiltrated the majority of the US's main media outlets, including news broadcast stations, journals, magazines, newspapers, movies, and radio, planting anti-communist propaganda and focusing the narrative on good old American values. The CIA had hundreds of members of the press, including many higher-up publishers and editors from across the nation, secretly on the government payroll from the 1950s to the 1970s. These reporters and journalists would discreetly gather information about public opinion and disseminate CIA-authored pro-American, anti-Soviet stories, even if they were a bit over-exaggerated. It was essentially the country's first wide-scale fake news factory. If you read any kind of news article in the time, chances are it was written, or at least heavily edited, by the CIA.
You are fake news.
The anti-communist propaganda had caused mass hysteria across the US, resulting in incidents like the Red Scare, which had Americans pitted against each other. You just never knew if your friendly, well-groomed, handsome neighbor was secretly a communist sympathizer. Oh hey Todd, yeah I'm just watering my flowers, making sure they're all getting watered equally. I bet they'd probably water themselves if I gave them the hose. By the 1970s, Americans started to actually think a bit for themselves. With recent disasters like the Vietnam War and Nixon's Watergate scandal, government trust was in a bear market, and the public was buying puts. As an execution of checks and balances, the US Senate had unanimously approved the formation of the Church Committee in 1975. This committee, which consisted of 11 politicians and lawyers, was tasked with exposing the many suspected abuses of the CIA. And with their research, they blew the whistle on many of the CIA's horrid atrocities, bringing them right into the public spotlight. These included the notorious Project MKUltra, various assassination attempts on foreign leaders, attempts at overthrowing foreign governments, and of course, Operation Mockingbird. So, what do you have to say to accusations of CIA propaganda? I'd say that you could take a propaganda at my asshole, Senator. After the jig was up, the CIA claimed that all operations had ceased on the Mockingbird front, but of course, we know that that's not true. Nowadays, every one of us has access to more information than we could possibly process in a lifetime. Each article, video, post, blog, algorithm, just a potential gateway to subliminal messaging and swaying our decisions. Operation Northwoods is one of those things where you'd ask yourself, the US government wouldn't really do that, would they? Yes. Yes, they would. Back in 1959, communism had hit too close to home for the United States. Just outside the Gulf of whatever this is now, trouble was a-brewing in Cuba. That would be the Cuban Revolution, headed by this scraggly little scoundrel. Having just overthrown a corrupt, fascist, and US-approved government rife with economic inequality, Castro sought to even the odds for his fellow Cubans moving forward. His answer? Communism, specifically the Marxist-Leninist flavor. But no matter the type of communism, the US wasn't too keen on having a communist nation a stone's throw away from the tip of its dongle. It also didn't help that Castro had seized control of all American businesses in Cuba, including sugar and coffee plantations and oil refineries. In response, five-star General President Eisenhower had slammed the communist government with strict restrictions on trade and vowed to cast Castro aside. But that was another president's job. In 1961, shiny new President John F. Kennedy had attempted to huck Castro out of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion. A group of about 1,500 anti-Castro Cuban revolutionaries were taken in, trained, and had millions of American dollars worth of military equipment thrown at them. Here, go kill Castro. And so they tried. The Bay of Pigs invasion, though, was an embarrassing failure. The Cuban military, over 200,000 strong, completely decimated the paltry invading force in just a few days. Now, having just warded off what he knew was essentially a US invasion, Castro felt a bit big in his britches. The US needed a better plan, but they were limited with what they could actually do. Since Cuba was buddy-buddy with the big communist motherland, a direct invasion by the US would almost certainly mean a Soviet invasion in Europe, so President Kennedy needed to really use his head for this one. But it was actually his brother that authored a solution. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy developed Operation Mongoose, a covert CIA operation designed to take down Castro's Cuba from the inside. CIA CIA-funded Cubans would be recruited in Miami and dumped in Cuba to form a revolutionary militia. The US would influence political support for the would-be revolutionaries, which would lead to an eventual coup and usurp Castro, giving the US the chance to shape the government however they wanted. But a key part of that plan was to convince other nations that Cuba was wild, irrational, and dangerous, to the point of supporting US intervention. This is where Operation Northwoods comes in, a proposed CIA covert false flag operation aimed at executing domestic and foreign acts of terror against innocent civilians in order to justify aggressive US military action against Cuba. Some of the proposed terrorist acts included destroying a US ship and conducting fake funerals, attacking Cuban refugees seeking haven in Miami, planting plastic bombs in strategic locations in Miami, destroying Dominican Republic crops and planting false evidence, and staging attacks on US aircraft. And the list goes on. But the most damning evidence comes straight from the source. Here's an excerpt from the declassified Operation Northwoods document, highlighting a plan to fake a plane hijacking. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft should appear to continue as harassing measures condoned by the government of Cuba. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft. The duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. The document goes on to explain how both planes would follow the same flight path, with the duplicate passenger-carrying craft secretly landing and safely evacuating all passengers. This plane would then be reverted back to its original appearance. The original empty plane would then continue its flight path over Cuba. Once in Cuban airspace, fake pilot radio transmissions would play, declaring that the plane was under attack by Cuban aircraft. The transmission would then be cut off by the plane's remote detonation, simulating its destruction by Cuban forces. The culmination of these events would undoubtedly rally Americans against the Cuban government, justifying and essentially greenlighting an American invasion. But then a little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. Turns out that the Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is hilarious, because the United States secretly installed nuclear missiles in Turkey. This was the closest the world ever came to an actual nuclear apocalypse. In order to avoid mutual destruction, the Soviets agreed to dismantle their nukes under the condition that the US dismantled their own nukes and cease all military aggression against Cuba. And with that agreement, Operation Mongoose was terminated and Operation Northwoods was shelved, hopefully never inspiring any future events. Operation Paperclip. Even if you're not a history junkie, you've probably heard of this. This is where US government ethics completely disintegrated like a big green fart in the wind. The Second World War wasn't one of just military strength, but of cunning, intelligence, and ingenuity as well. Emerging technologies gave each side advantages on the war front. The UK with its code-breaking Colossus computer, Germany with its devastating V-2 rocket technology, and of course the US with its catastrophic atomic bombs. Nazi Germany had some of the greatest scientific minds of the modern age. It's an indisputable fact. And after Germany's surrender, the US wanted to leverage that expertise for its own technological advancements. Of course, there was also a concern that the Soviets would attempt the same thing, so it became a matter of national security.
Well, the Soviets did end up yoinking over 2,500 scientists and various equipment for themselves under Operation Oswiecim, but no one ever really talks about that.
In July of 1945, a mere 2 months after the Mame Mustache himself downed a pill and a bullet, Operation Overcast, later renamed Operation Paperclip, had commenced. An operation designed to scoop up Nazi scientists from Germany, seize their research and technologies, and grant them asylum in the US so they can help develop weapons against Japan, who was still very much determined to win the Pacific Theater. Something they'll retrospectively regret in about a month. Most of the scientists recruited were experts in the fields of rocket science, aviation, and chemical and biological warfare. Over 1,600 Nazi scientists were recruited into the American scientific community and given research jobs. That would be a hell of a resume. Okay, looks like it says here you held a position for a bit in Auschwitz, hope I'm saying that right, as a camp counselor. Why don't you tell me more about that? No, that's okay.
Operation Paperclip had absorbed some of the most prominent figures of the German scientific community. For example, you had Hubertus Struckhold, an aeronautical medical researcher. He was recruited into NASA and went on to design critical astronaut protective equipment for various spaceflight missions. During World War II, however, he was complicit in several human experiments at the Dachau concentration camp. There was also Heinz Haber, an aeronautical physicist that also participated in human experimentation efforts to further his research. Haber eventually became the chief scientific consultant for the Walt Disney Company in the 1950s. And of course, there was former SS officer Werner von Braun, Germany's leading rocket technology engineer who helped design the V-2 rocket through brutal slave labor. He became a NASA director and one of the most prominent figures in the American space frontier. He also worked with the Walt Disney Company to popularize the subject of human space travel. With American scientists now welcoming their new, funny-talking coworkers of questionable origin, the US had some cleaning up to do. See, the American public had zero knowledge of Operation Paperclip's existence, so it was up to the government to rebrand these Nazis as good old wholesome geniuses who all coincidentally wave at a 45-degree angle. Histories were hidden and war crimes were scrubbed for the sake of technological progress. And boy oh boy was there progress. With the help from the Germans, the US made unprecedented breakthroughs in aeronautical technology, largely contributing to the US's success in the space race against the Soviet Union with the Apollo missions. Over the following decades, however, many of Operation Paperclip's beneficiaries found themselves in the crosshairs of American journalists. Previously buried pasts were soon dug up, and links to war crimes were being reconnected. Fearing persecution and eventual prosecution, many of the scientists got the hell out of the US to seek refuge elsewhere. Although rumors of paperclips circulated as early as 1946, the official documents were formally declassified under President Clinton's Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998. Pretty messed up, right? Secret spy gadgets, huh? You know all about the Cold War, right? It was that time between the 1940s and 1980s where the United States of America and the United States of Soviet Russia, or whatever it stood for, decided to really duke it out on whose economic system was superior for worldwide domination. Capitalism or communism? But since the USSR is nowhere to be found on a modern map and over 300 versions of Monopoly are available on the market, it's pretty clear who won. Now, it was called the Cold War because neither superpower actually fought each other directly. Instead, everything was just one big wiener measuring competition, from who could build better weapons to who could make more countries kill each other. But sometimes, sneaky measures were taken to get the upper hand, and that's where spies came in. Highly trained agents designed to infiltrate enemy lines and carefully yoink critical information from the other side, among other fruitful missions. But they needed to be creative in their method of extracting information to avoid getting caught. Good spies don't get caught. Perhaps the most common tool in a spy's arsenal was the hidden camera. In order to follow the cardinal rule of pics or it didn't happen, these discreet little lenses were used to secretly take pictures of sensitive documents or sensitive people without being too obvious.
Это на сумме секрет не документ.
Really? Could you flip that over, please?
Yes, of course.
The clever cameras were carefully concealed in copious quantities of clothes and components like coats, coins, and cleavage. Perhaps one of the most effective types was the microdot camera, a tiny camera used to make even tinier pictures. About the size of a small coin, these little wonders captured images of full-size sensitive documents, but thanks to a special lens and some fancy physics, the resulting image would be scaled down to just a dot. A microdot, if you will. These microdots measured about 1 millimeter in length and could easily be snuck back into headquarters where they could be magnified and properly read. Gotcha. But taking pictures of a few confidential documents was small-time work. Sometimes you need to think bigger, like entire secret bases bigger. So in order to get a bird's eye view on the landscape, you had to do just that. That's where the employment and deployment of pigeon cameras came in. Specially trained pigeons that had big old cameras strapped to their chests and sent flying across areas where the camera could reveal potential bases and strategic locations. But if seeing wasn't an option, then listening was an acceptable alternative. It was a common tactic for intelligence operations to bug a room, meaning that multiple listening devices would be planted around said room or on an agent. But some smartass took the term bug a little too literal, which is how the dragonfly insectothopter became reality. But why oh why the dragonfly? Well, because a regular fly is too small and swattable, and while a prototype for a bumblebee was developed, it was noted that real bees are too erratic when they fly. And so if a couple of savvy sleuths noticed a bumblebee just kind of hovering around in the air, it was a telltale sign that your business was being recorded. Dragonflies, though, can kind of just hover for a while, and so it's a little less suspicious. Plus, their long, slender bodies were a perfect shape to house the mechanics necessary to be a microphone with wings. I'm sorry, how many missiles did you say in Cuba? Is there a lake nearby or something? But if you had insectophobia, then what could be the next best thing? This thing. The Thing. This vaguely named piece of woodwork was a hand-carved US Great Seal gifted by the Soviet Union to a US ambassador a few weeks before World War II ended. I guess the USSR wanted to get an early jump on the whole spying thing. It was hung up in the ambassador's private study as a way to passively listen in on conversations. But how? Hidden in the wood carving was an antenna that, although mechanically simple, was pretty impressive technology. Invented by Leon Tiedemann, who is famous for also inventing the theremin, that weird frequency instrument that goes off. This listening device had no power source or wires, rendering it virtually undetectable. No way. Instead, a remote radio frequency would turn on the device, allowing the Soviets to actively listen in whenever those perverts pleased. Classified as a resonant cavity microphone, it was basically a tiny diaphragm that would vibrate from sound waves of people yapping. Those vibrations are then transformed into a signal which was sent back to the Soviets. The device was so well hidden that it actually wasn't found until 7 years later. Yo Dave, check this out, the Soviets put a freaking microphone in the seal.
Those commie bastards were listening this whole time?
I'm gonna rip it out.
No, wait. I have an idea. Time to listen in on the Americans. I hate my job. Now you might be thinking, man, microphones and cameras? That shit's lame on God for real, or whatever the flip y'all say today. Well, if I were mean, this is where I would put something loud to blow out your eardrums in retaliation. But I'm not gonna do that. Next up in the spy arsenal, sounds like an idea that someone just pulled out of their ass. You ever see like a Swiss Army knife with its super convenient and practical tools like knives and saws and screwdrivers? Now imagine if you got the sudden urge to just ram that thing up your anatomical back pocket for later retrieval in a pinch. Well, you're in luck I guess, because that's what the rectal toolkit is for. Hey, at least it's better than a glass jar. Used mainly by very brave CIA agents at the height of the Cold War, this toolkit was equipped with all the aforementioned tools needed to get yourself out of a shitty situation, all conveniently contained in a ribbed for your pleasure capsule. Although convenient, there might be a few obvious tells of the supportive suppository. Alright, the guards are distracted. Let's move out. I'm right behind you. Oh geez. Sometimes a spy needs a quick getaway. Luckily, there are plenty of opportunities at your disposal. Perhaps a spy's best offense was a solid defense of remaining anonymous and indiscernible amongst a crowd. Many spies were artists in terms of changing disguises on the fly to get any would-be pursuers off their trail. But if changing clothes didn't do the trick, then the 5-second mask would. This was a latex mask developed for quick identity theft on the go. In just 5 seconds, as the name implies, one could assume an entirely new appearance from the shoulders up, complete with facial hair and a hairline that screams, "I've got a mortgage, an unsatisfied wife, and 3 ungrateful brats at home." No enemy agents would suspect a thing, but they would certainly be sympathetic towards your new fake backstory. Maybe even empathetic. Godspeed, soldier. But if you're still being tailed and need a quick diversion, it might be time to deploy the Jack-in-the-Box. Constructed from a hopefully unused sex doll, this inflatable fellow served as a decoy for a vehicular getaway. When getting Ubered away from a mission, you may get a feeling that you're being followed and need to quickly vamoose.
The enemy's coming in, you're behind. Do a barrel roll.
Assuming your driver knows the assignment and you tipped him well, he can quickly turn a corner while you delicately tuck and roll to safety. The Jack-in-the-Box is then quickly inflated where you were sitting, convincing your assailants that you didn't just take yourself out by slamming your dome into a street lamp at 35 miles an hour. However, there may be a chance where the jig is up and you get got. No need to worry though, they can't extract information from you if you're completely dead. You know that famous Pirates of the Caribbean quote.
Dead guys don't say things much.
The thing is, it's very unpatriotic to give up confidential information to an enemy entity. traitorous even. So in order to not disgrace your home country that put you in this dangerous pickle in the first place, you have one last resort. A lethal dose of cyanide hidden in your false tooth. Just gnaw on that sucker like one of grandma's old strawberry candies to earn your one-way ticket to Sleepy Bye Junction. Now, if you've got the stones for it and you want to fight back, that's where the real fun stuff begins, with an arsenal of concealed weapons at your disposal. This first one really packs a punch. This is the Sedgley OSS 38 single-shot glove pistol, a relatively simple weapon capable of delivering a very simple death. See, with a gun, you pull a trigger and your point comes across pretty quickly. With a glove gun, you get to punch them in the face while you're at it. It's like killing two birds with one stone, but it's killing one face with a bullet and a fist. So when you're in a bout of fisticuffs and your opponent insists you give him your best shot, boy will he be surprised. For you ladies out there looking to discreetly apply a nice shade of red to yourself and a target, there's the lipstick pistol, also referred to as the Kiss of Death. This little guy was a single-shot 4.5mm pistol hidden in a lipstick holder used by the KGB. They were the Soviet equivalent of the CIA. Easily disguised as a harmless accessory in a handbag, this weapon could be concealed next to your concealer and make up the foundation of your arsenal. I would imagine such an encounter would go like this. Oh wow, what a lovely shade. What color is that? It's called You're Gonna. You're gonna? Yeah, you're gonna die. You're gonna die. Ooh, how exotic sounding.
How does it look?
Ugh, okay, maybe such tactics are a little bit messy. Let's shoot for something more surreptitious, like poison. Poison's great when you're not on the receiving end of it. If you don't want the hassle of dirty work to rain on your parade, you can opt for the Bulgarian umbrella. This clever contraption looks like a typical umbrella, but it isn't. Obviously. This umbrella Ella actually contains a pneumatic element which, when triggered, will launch a poison dart towards any target you desire. The poison of choice was ricin, a potent chemical which, when injected, will cause massive internal bleeding and organ failure, guaranteed to put a damper on anyone's day. The Bulgarian umbrella is referred to as such because the most famous use of the device was in 1978 when a KGB agent assassinated a Bulgarian enemy of the state right in the middle of the streets of London.
Is someone there?
I suppose if you really want to take aim at who you're pumping full of poison, then equip yourself with the ominously named heart attack gun. Revealed to the general public in 1975, this firearm was, as the name implies, capable of delivering one free heart attack by means of a lethal injection of shellfish toxin right into the bloodstream. The toxin was discovered by one Miss Mary Embry of the CIA. Her discovery also played a major role in Project MK Naomi, a secret US program aimed at developing biological weapons during the Cold War and a successor to the infamous Project MK Ultra. The poison was frozen into a compact dart and fired at a high speed. Once it penetrated the target, it would melt and be absorbed into the body. The toxin would spread and mimic the symptoms of an innocent heart attack. Only a tiny red dot was the evidence that anything malicious had even happened, besides a dead body.